Last week, my coworkers and I decided to rent an apartment in the city center through one of those popular home-sharing apps. We had an important conference over the weekend and wanted a comfortable place to stay together. The listing looked perfect: ideal location, beautiful photos, and an affordable price. We were excited to spend time together outside of the work environment. On the day we arrived, the host started sending several messages, insisting on meeting us in person. I thought it was a little strange, but I assumed he just wanted to welcome us. When we got to the apartment, he suddenly appeared, saying he needed to show us some important details about the place. Although I found it a bit invasive, I didn't want to seem rude, so I let it slide. That first night, we were all exhausted from the day of traveling and decided to rest early. While I was getting ready for bed, I noticed that the smoke detector in the room was flashing a red light intermittently. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just something normal. However, during the night, I woke up with the strange feeling that I was being watched. I shook my head, laughing at myself for being paranoid, and went back to sleep. The next day, one of my coworkers mentioned that the phone charger in the living room wasn't working. I went to check and noticed that the charger seemed different, heavier than usual. When I looked closely at it, I saw a tiny, almost imperceptible lens. My heart froze. Was that a camera? We began inspecting the apartment and found other suspicious devices scattered around the rooms. At that point, panic set in. We felt completely violated. We immediately turned off all the suspicious devices and covered the lenses we found. Some of us wanted to confront the host right away, but others thought it would be better to first document everything and go to the police. We decided to take pictures and record videos of all the equipment that appeared to have hidden cameras. While we were doing this, we heard a noise at the door. The host was trying to enter again, claiming he needed to check a problem with the plumbing. That was the last straw. We told him it wasn't a good time and that we were busy. He insisted, but we didn't open the door. The atmosphere became tense and the sense of danger only increased. Feeling unsafe, we decided the best course of action was to leave the apartment immediately. We hurriedly packed our things, always looking over our shoulders. As we were gathering our stuff, we could hear footsteps outside the door. The host seemed to be pacing back and forth, mumbling something we couldn't understand. My heart raced and adrenaline took over. Every second in that place felt like an eternity, and all I wanted was to get out of there as quickly as possible. We managed to escape through the back door, trying to avoid any direct confrontation. On the street, we called a car and went straight to the nearest police station. There, we told them everything that had happened, showing the photos and videos we had as evidence. The officers took our accounts seriously and assured us they would investigate the case. Still, the feeling of violation and fear wouldn't leave us. None of us wanted to return to that apartment. And we spent the rest of the weekend in a hotel. However, what happened next was even more disturbing. The following day, while we were at the hotel, we received a call from the front desk saying that someone had been asking for us. It was the host from the apartment. We couldn't understand how he had found us. The discomfort returned with full force. We asked the front desk to inform him that we didn't want to be disturbed. By this point, we began to feel like we were being stalked. Every noise in the hotel hallway put us on edge. We decided not to let this affect us and went to the conference as planned. But even there, the feeling of being watched didn't leave us. During one of the breaks, I noticed a familiar figure in the distance. It was hard to be sure, but it looked very much like the host. When I tried to point him out to my coworkers, he had already disappeared into the crowd. That collective paranoia was consuming us, and we no longer knew what was real and what was just in our heads. My wife and I had just moved into a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs. It was exactly what we were looking for: tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and the perfect environment to start a family. The house next door always had the blinds closed, but we didn't think much of it. We found out that it was frequently rented out for short-term stays, but we didn't imagine this would become a problem. We were excited to start this new chapter in our lives. Everything was going well until one weekend when a large group rented the house next door. On the first night, we were woken up by loud music and laughter echoing down the street. People were in the front yard, drinking and talking loudly. We tried to ignore it, thinking it would just be a one-time party, but things began to get out of hand. The party went on into the early hours, and the tranquility we had hoped to find in this neighborhood seemed to vanish. The next night, the situation worsened. The music got even louder, and people we had never seen before started roaming around our street. Some cars parked in front of our garage, blocking the way out. When I politely asked them to move their vehicles, I was met with hostile stares and sarcastic comments. On my way back to the house, I noticed some of these people were climbing the fence and entering our backyard. I felt a knot in my stomach seeing strangers trampling the garden my wife had cared for so lovingly. The concern turned into fear when we heard the sound of glass breaking. We discovered that one of the windows of our car had been shattered. That was too much. We felt like prisoners in our own home, insecure and disrespected. We decided to call the police, hoping they could resolve the situation. When the officers arrived, the party was temporarily interrupted, but as soon as they left, everything returned to chaos. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. The next morning, we gathered with a few neighbors to discuss what was happening. We found out that we weren't the only ones bothered by the constant parties at the house next door. Many people were concerned about the neighborhood's safety and the impact these short-term rentals were having on our community. We decided it was time to take collective action. Some suggested speaking with the homeowner, while others thought it would be better to involve the local authorities right away. We chose to call the police again, this time with the support of several neighbors. When the officers arrived, we explained the situation and how the parties were getting out of control, causing damage and putting everyone at risk. The police presence finally dispersed the group, but we knew this was just a temporary fix. The tension in the neighborhood increased, and we began questioning whether moving there was the right decision. The issue of short-term rentals became a point of contention among the residents, and what had once been a peaceful place was now embroiled in conflict and insecurity. Even after the incident, things didn't improve. We began receiving suspicious looks from some residents who supported short-term rentals, claiming we were overreacting and damaging the neighborhood's reputation. Local social media was filled with heated debates, and it seemed like a divide had formed within the community. All we wanted was peace and safety, but now we were at the center of a controversy we hadn't anticipated when we moved there. My wife became increasingly anxious, and I couldn't relax at home either. Every weekend was filled with uncertainty. We didn't know what kind of people would rent the house next door and what problems might arise. We started considering the possibility of moving again, even though we knew how exhausting and frustrating that would be. We never imagined that our search for a quiet place to live would lead to so much anxiety and stress. The following weeks were a real test of our sanity. Every time we heard any noise coming from the house next door, our hearts would race. One night, around 2 a.m, we woke up to a loud crash. I ran to the window and saw that someone had thrown trash into our backyard. Torn bags, food scraps, and bottles scattered everywhere. I felt a mix of anger and despair. We called the police again, but when they arrived, there was no one around. The feeling that we were being intentionally targeted by these actions consumed us. We began questioning whether we were being paranoid or if there really was someone trying to intimidate us. My wife started having trouble sleeping, and I felt powerless for not being able to protect her from this situation. We decided to install security cameras, hoping to catch any suspicious activity. However, even with the cameras, nothing seemed to change, and the tension only grew. A few days later, while we were watching TV at night, the alarm in our backyard went off. We looked through the cameras and saw 2 men walking around our property. One of them appeared drunk, staggering, and laughing loudly, while the other pointed something toward our house. I grabbed my phone and called the police immediately. While we waited, the 2 men began kicking one of our chairs outside. The sound of their laughter, mixed with the alarm, was unbearable. I wanted to go out and confront them, but my wife held me back, afraid of what might happen. When the police arrived, the men were already gone. We showed them the footage from the cameras, and they said they would file the report. But without identifying the culprits, there was little they could do. That response was like a bucket of cold water. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. Even with all the measures we had taken, it seemed like we were completely at the mercy of people who didn't care about the consequences of their actions. We felt trapped in our own home, something that should have been our sanctuary. On my last trip for a job interview, I rented a private room in a shared house through a vacation rental app. The description seemed calm, and the host's reviews were good enough that I didn't think twice. When I arrived, I was greeted by him, who seemed friendly, but had a somewhat peculiar way about him. He showed me the room and the common areas, but made sure to emphasize that some parts of the house were strictly private. I thought that was a little strange, but didn't want to seem suspicious. After all, it was just for one night. Everything seemed normal until the middle of the night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of light footsteps in the hallway. My room was at the end, so any movement there was hard to ignore. I waited in silence, trying to convince myself it was just in my head, until I saw a shadow moving under the door. My heart raced, but I stayed still. Who was there? Why would someone be walking around in the hallway in the middle of the night? I stayed awake for what seemed like hours, too scared to leave the room. The next morning, I couldn't ignore what had happened. I decided to check if my things were where I had left them, and I noticed that my suitcase was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. I decided to match in anything to the host, but the distrust had already settled in. Before I left for the interview, I set my phone in a corner of the room to record during the day. It wasn't something I usually did, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave my mind. When I returned in the late afternoon, I grabbed my phone and watched the recording. My heart froze. Around 3 p.m., the host entered the room. He looked around, opened my suitcase, and rummaged through some clothes. It looked like he was inspecting everything carefully, as if he were looking for something. I felt violated, betrayed, and extremely vulnerable. That's when I realized I couldn't just ignore what was happening. I needed to confront him and make sure it stopped immediately. I gathered my courage and went to the host, trying to stay calm while my mind was racing. I showed him the video on my phone and asked directly why he had entered my room. He tried to cover it up at first, saying he was just checking if everything was okay, but the excuse didn't make sense. When I pressed him, he started getting defensive and eventually angry, saying it was his house and he had the right to check whatever he wanted. That only increased my discomfort and the feeling of danger. I immediately left and found another place to stay, even if it meant sleeping in my car. Before I left, I contacted the rental app support to report the incident. I explained the situation and sent the video as evidence. Fortunately, they were receptive and promised to investigate. However, even after all of this, that feeling of invasion and insecurity still haunts me. The thought that someone could be watching or going through my things while I was sleeping is something that still keeps me up at night. I never imagined that such a simple stay could turn into such a disturbing nightmare. Last week, a few friends and I rented a cabin by a lake to spend a few peaceful days away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The place seemed perfect, surrounded by trees with an incredible view of the lake and a silence that was almost therapeutic. At first, everything was great. We spent the first day fishing, chatting, and enjoying the peace we were looking for. But by the end of that afternoon, something started to feel off. While we were by the lake, a man appeared out of nowhere. He seemed to be a neighbor, though he didn't say that directly. He just started making small talk, asking where we were from, how long we'd be staying, and even what we had brought to eat and drink. At first, we thought he was just being friendly, but the way he kept staring at us while talking made us feel uncomfortable. He abruptly said goodbye and left, but for some reason, none of us could fully relax after that. The next morning, while we were preparing breakfast, we noticed the same man standing at the edge of the property, looking at the cabin. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. When he realized we had noticed him, he waved and slowly walked away. That left us feeling uneasy, but we tried to ignore it. We decided to go fishing and enjoy the day on the lake, but when we were setting up our things on the shore, there he was again, at a reasonable distance, but clearly watching us. This time, he came up to us uninvited and started making strange comments about the lake, saying how it was deep enough to hide anything. We nervously laughed, but the atmosphere became tense. He seemed to be enjoying our discomfort, almost like he knew he was bothering us on purpose. When he finally left, we talked among ourselves about how weird it was getting. The idea that he could be watching us constantly made every sound in the forest around us feel like an alert. That night, while we were sitting around the campfire trying to relax, we had the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest around us was dense, and the usual nighttime sounds were there, but it felt like something else was present. One of my friends pointed out a shadow moving between the trees, and even though we tried to convince ourselves it was just an animal, we all knew what we were thinking. The neighbor. We stayed silent for a few minutes, staring in the direction of the movement, but saw nothing else. Later, when we went back inside the cabin, we noticed that one of the chairs on the deck had been moved. None of us remembered leaving it that way. It was a small change, but enough to make the paranoia grow. We decided to lock all the doors and windows and go to sleep, but sleep was hard to come by. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. I didn't have the courage to get up and look, but I prayed it was just my imagination. The next morning, we all agreed we didn't want to spend another night there. The next morning, we started packing our things earlier than planned. The mood was already heavy, and none of us wanted to admit out loud that we were scared, but it was obvious. As we were loading our bags into the car, we noticed the neighbor standing a short distance away, watching again. He didn't say anything, just stood there, motionless, as if he were studying us. That cold stare was the confirmation that we were making the right decision by leaving. Before we left, we tried calling the owner to explain what had happened. He sounded surprised, but not as concerned as we expected. He mentioned that the neighbor had a peculiar reputation, but avoided going into details. The drive back was filled with silence, with all of us still processing how uncomfortable the experience had been. To this day, whenever I see a cabin or a lake in pictures, I feel a chill. It was supposed to be an escape from the routine, but it ended up being a reminder that tranquility isn't always what it seems. We chose the historic house because it seemed perfect for our family vacation. As soon as we arrived, we were captivated by the old details: the creaky wooden floors, the faded wallpaper, and the stained glass in the windows. It felt like stepping into a living piece of the past. At night, while everyone was asleep, I heard a strange sound in the hallway, like light footsteps. I went out to check, but didn't see anything. I thought it was just my imagination or the wind. The next morning, I noticed that the front door was unlocked. I clearly remembered locking it before going to sleep. I mentioned it to my wife, and she said she also felt something strange the night before, like someone was standing in the room, but she thought it was just fatigue. The kids started complaining about missing items. Our son's favorite toy, which had been in the living room, appeared on the porch. We started to notice little things that didn't make sense, but we tried not to worry. By the third day, the noises became more frequent. They seemed to be coming from the attic, but none of our things were stored up there. My instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I went upstairs to check, everything seemed in order, except for a chair that was tipped over in the corner of the room. The air felt colder up there, even though it was summer. I decided not to mention it to my wife, not wanting to scare her, but I started to feel uneasy. At night, things got more intense. The doors we had locked were open again, and the sounds started getting closer, like they were coming from inside the kids' room. My wife suddenly woke up, saying she heard whispers near the bed. We turned on the lights and stayed awake for the rest of the night. The next morning, we decided to ask the locals about the history of the house, since everything was feeling stranger by the minute. When we spoke to one of the shopkeepers in town, He asked if we were staying in the big house on the hill. When we confirmed, he looked at us seriously and told us that the house had a dark history. Decades ago, an unsolved disappearance had occurred there, involving an entire family. Longtime residents believed that something from those tragedies still lingered in the place. That left us deeply unsettled. We returned to the house that afternoon, but the atmosphere felt different, as if we were being watched. The kids were more restless, and my wife started insisting that we should leave before the end of our stay. That night, when I went to grab something from the kitchen, I saw the living room chair moving on its own. I froze. There was no draft, no one was near it. I decided we wouldn't spend another night there. We quickly packed up, with the kids asking what was going on. My wife didn't question it. She seemed to feel the same heaviness I did. We left the house in the middle of the night, and as we passed the gate, I swore I saw a figure in the second-floor window. To this day, we avoid talking about it, as if acknowledging what happened could give strength to whatever haunted us.